Hello, everyone. This is Kate Stillman with the Yoga Healer podcast, and I'm here with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's a senior research scientist at MIT. She's published over 200, that is such a staggering number, 200 peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals and conference proceedings. And the way that I found you was the wonderful topic of glycosates and what's going on for a book I was writing called Uninflamed, all about humans reducing chronic inflammation to prevent chronic disease. In the glyphosate conversation and situation, for those who don't know it, it's a pervasive herbicide. It's in Roundup, and I think Stephanie knows probably more about it than anyone else in the world at this point.
It could be.
I mean, my real first question for you, I mean, and it's kind of not fair to start at the end, but I mean, it is such a depressing topic, and you've been in this topic for decades. And first off, it seems like the problem's getting worse, not better over time, where more and more of our ecosystems are polluted by this profit-producing chemical that's not benefiting future generations, that's not benefiting our ecosystems, that's not benefiting any of us in terms of our human bodies. Is it getting worse? And if so, like, how do you do it? Like, how do you stay in the game?
Oh, I know. It's so discouraging, isn't it? Sometimes it just seems hopeless. And I just keep pushing on because I feel like, what else are you going to do, right? And we just have to keep trying to get the message out. And people are waking up. I think more organic food is growing exponentially. I mean, there's a lot more people interested in buying organic, which is putting pressure on the farmers to grow organic. That's exciting. We're seeing a lot more organic choices at a local grocery store that's just a regular, ordinary grocery store. And Costco has lots and lots of organic. So very good resources. And you can, of course, order organic on the web too, which is what we do when we can't find it locally. We just order it on the web. So it's much easier to stay certified organic these days than it was even 10 years ago. So that's really good news. And that's that's probably mainly due to consumer pressure. And the consumer pressure is coming from people like me who are telling the consumers you have to eat certified organic if you want to be healthy. And I really believe that. I really do believe that.
Oh, and I'm so glad we started with this because it's like these conversations that I'm sure you have every day. It's hard. It's a lot of hard stuff that we're about to talk about. And just to know that that some things are really getting better is huge. And if we do look at, Amazon owning Whole Foods and the size of Costco buying more organics, that those are two massive indicators, right? That
Exactly.
Companies are paying attention.
Right. And also Bayer's having a hard time right now. And you may not know this, but over the last 2 or 3 weeks, they've been failing every way where they turn in terms of the legal system, which is really, really awesome. And it's been like there were these 3 lawsuits that for linking glyphosate to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And they were about it's probably 2 or 3 years ago, maybe. I'm forgetting exactly. I remember very well the moment in which we heard the victory because they had 3 lawsuits, jury trial. And the first one, which was Dwayne Lee Johnson, he was a school grounds keeper and he used Roundup exclusively to kill the weeds in the properties of the schools that he handled in California. And he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in his 40s. He was a father of 2 young kids, and it was pretty devastating. And Monsanto was quite uninterested in helping him with his problems, just kind of dismissing it. And the legal case eventually revealed that Monsanto had really basically almost corruption, in terms of infiltrating the whole research community to make sure that papers that are put Roundup in an unfavorable light don't get published, or if they get published, they get retracted. There's a lot of shenanigans going on, hiring people to author papers that Monsanto folks wrote, that kind of thing, hiring prestigious people, paying them a lot of money to just put their name on the paper type of thing. There's a lot of stuff going on to make sure that Roundup stays on the market and to deny that there's any problem. So when he won that lawsuit, it was amazing. And he got a huge award. I forget it, $183 million or something like that. Most of it was punitive because of Monsanto's shenanigans. And then it went through upper courts and all this stuff. And the judge cut it way back. Eventually it was a lot less, but 2 more lawsuits were very similar. Also jury trial, also Roundup, exclusively using Roundup. And they were people like on their own property using Roundup. both of them got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they won, and then there was another one, Hardeman, I think it was Hardeman, same story, he won. So that's 3 lawsuits where they won large sums. And then all 3 of those lawsuits have been making their way up the chain, finally to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, thank you. This week, I think it was for the 2 of them. And his is already resolved. I think all of them are now resolved, with Monsanto being forced, or Bayer being forced to pay. Bayer bought Monsanto right before all this stuff happened. I have a feeling Monsanto was better at keeping the lawsuits in control than Bayer was. Bayer was not experienced on how you do that, I suspect, is why all of a sudden the lawsuit started working. And so now they have to pay up a whole bunch. And now there's like tens of thousands of people with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma lawsuits accusing glyphosate of causing their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And Bayer was trying really, really hard to get to a point where those people couldn't, like, to do some kind of class action lawsuit. They did something with like $10 billion, just one lump sum, to say nobody can ever sue us again for this. And that didn't work either. So now they're stuck. Like, they have to just face tens of thousands of lawsuits on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then they've decided they're not going to sell Roundup, glyphosate-based Roundup, to the United States residential market anymore. Starting at some 2023 or something, they're going to stop allowing Americans to have access to Roundup that has glyphosate in it. They're going to put something else in there, and it's probably also equally bad, but it won't be glyphosate. So that's a big win for us.
Wow.
But of course, the food industry is still perfectly fine. No problem. Go ahead, use it. That's where it really counts, because we're getting it all over our food supply.
Right.
It's in lots and lots of foods. And I think it's causing autism. It's causing a lot of diseases.
Okay, great. So let's go to the beginning now. What is glyphosate?
So glyphosate is the active ingredient in the pervasive herbicide Roundup, which people mostly know to kill the dandelions in their yard or to deal with the weeds growing in the walkway. Very convenient, completely safe for humans, no toxic effects, but kills every plant that it sees, except for the ones that have been engineered to resist it through GMO technology. And that's part of the thing. The food crops, corn, soy, canola, Roundup, corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, cotton. Those are the key crops that have been designed to be resistant to glyphosate through the genetic engineering process. They've inserted a bacterial gene into the genome of the plant to keep it safe from glyphosate. So you can just spray the glyphosate all over the plant. It doesn't die. Very convenient to control the weeds. And so the farmers love it, although it's causing troubles, as they see year by year, because it's messing up the soil. It's messing up the soil bacteria. It's depleting the minerals. It's causing a lot of runoff because there's not enough organic matter in the soil. So you're getting a lot more and less resistance to drought in the plant. So you see much more heartache when you get a dry spot. And so we've got lots and lots of trouble with the weather that's compounded by the toxicity of the glyphosate on the crop. Even the crop that's engineered to resist it is not entirely safe from glyphosate. It has that one enzyme that's been fixed, but the rest of it is still susceptible. And then, of course, it's not really true that it's safe. I mean, that's the thing that is really, really bad, because the industry cheated when they did the studies back in the 1970s or even 60s. They did some pretty sleazy studies and got the EPA to sign off on the product without adequate testing.
Was it the kind of thing where there's Monsanto employees in the EPA running the tests? Like, was it one of those deals?
Well, it's very similar to that, of course. There's a lot of, back and forth there. Like, these guys, there's a circulating revolving door, they call it, where you become a regulator, and then you get a good job at a company that pays you well to do the thing that you were regulating. So it's a ridiculous system. The EPA, it really depends upon the industry to keep its funding. So it's just ridiculous as far as the influence that they have over the regulators, such that they don't want to say no to these people. And then they did a lot of cheating on the studies. One thing, they set up some rules. They said you only have to look for 3 months to see if it's toxic. And if everything looks good for animal studies, if everything looks good after 3 months, you're good to go. And that's one rule they created. And so Seralini, and this was what got me started on glyphosate, really. It was a paper by Professor Seralini's team in France. And they decided to do the same study. Basically, they repeated a study that Monsanto had done with the rats, same dosage, same number of rats even, and same type of rat, I believe. And so they basically just said, well, let's just repeat this, but let's not stop at 3 months. Let's keep going for the entire lifespan with that same small dose and see what happens. And so he told me, At 3 months, everything looked good. There wasn't any obvious difference between the control rats and the ones that were being treated. At 4 months, you started to see some problems. And by the time the lifespan was over, you saw lots of problems. There were massive mammary tumors in the females. The males had kidney damage, liver damage. Both genders had reproductive issues, early death. They were significantly shorter lifespan. So all these things happened with a low dose over the entire lifespan of these rats. You clearly saw a problem. And they published that paper. And of course, the industry pressure on the publisher, finally got it retracted. And then, which is what they do. When they, first of all, they work really hard not to let it get published, to stop the publication by putting a reviewer on the team to say, no, this paper is terrible. I'm never going to accept it. They do this. I'm sure they do this. I mean, I can't believe they don't, because I've experienced it firsthand, where all the reviewers love your paper except for one who absolutely will not accept it no matter what. And that can kill it, And so they've got a lot of influence over.
And that's at the level of the journal publishing it, like whether it's Science or Nature or.
Right. They I don't know. I mean, I'm not in the back room. I don't know the details, but I suspect, I highly suspect that they've got a way to, oh, this is a paper we got to worry about. Let's get one of our reviewers on it. And they must have some way of doing that. Yeah. And I don't know how that works, but I just believe it because I've experienced it more than once,
Yeah. Well, actually, Lex Friedman was talking about it with Joe Rogan yesterday. Well, to reference it, it was the 4th of July podcast 2022. Same deal with like who's controlling the narrative and how do they infiltrate influencers, right? And it's like, and how do you know? And it's like, well, if it stinks of narrative, if it stinks of the old narrative that we know is toxic, you can draw your own conclusion.
I know you can't, they make sure, I mean, they work very hard to keep it secret what they're doing, but you sort of see it from the outside and eventually you think this must be what's going on, when it happens enough times. And they'll also reject, journals will reject your paper outright. I've had this happen too. And it's not appropriate for our journal. This paper is not about, not the correct topic for our journal, which it clearly is, but they deny it. They just say no. They won't even review it. They just kick it back,
Yeah. No, that happened to me with my Uninflamed. Yeah, kick it back. It's like, nope, not for our readers. Yeah.
They don't want the controversy around it because, and then they get really pressured too, because the first paper that Anthony Samsel and I, or the first paper I wrote on glyphosate was together with my collaborator, Anthony Samsel. And that was right at the time when the other paper got retracted. It was quite interesting because I had read, the Seralini paper, which had motivated me to study glyphosate. And this was in 2012, by the way. I've only been studying glyphosate since 2012. And so Anthony and I wrote this paper and we published it in a journal called Entropy, which is a respectable journal. It's one of those open access journals, but it's by no means a rag. It's in PubMed and all of that. It's a perfectly fine journal. And what one thing they did was to attack the journal, like called it a pay-per-view, sort of a predator journal. They called it a predator journal. And they said that, the paper, very sloppy, no review, they sort of accused it of being done unprofessionally. We had like 6 reviewers. We had 3 rounds of review, very, very well reviewed, but they just lie. They just say, oh, it's a predator journal, just pay some money, get your paper published, So that's what they do. So then the journal's under attack, right? They don't want to. They don't want to risk their reputation. Happen to them. So most journals say, I just won't publish this paper. But our journal, they tried to get it retracted, our paper. And it was right around the time that Seralini's paper got retracted. We got a note from the editor and they said, would you be willing to withdraw your paper? Which usually means we would like your paper to disappear, you know? And we said, no, thank you. No, we don't want to withdraw it. You're going to have to be forced to retract it. We didn't say that, but that was the implication. And a week later, they came back and basically said, oh, never mind, we didn't mean it. And then they published something, which is still up on their webpage. I just checked recently, where they made a statement that we will not bow to pressure from people who don't like something about a paper that was written, that we published, and we went through the peer review process. It's up there. We don't think it deserves to be retracted, and we're going to stand by our ground and go ahead and publish it anyway. So we were really lucky that they stood up to, and with some heat, of course, because now they're a rag journal. They're being accused of being what they're not. So as a consequence of it. So this is why many journals, is one of the reasons why many journals just won't go near this kind of work,
Yeah. Wow. So petrifying. Okay. So one of the big issues, so let's go through what the issues with, first of all, having the genetically engineered seeds that have this resistance to something that's, like your book's titled Toxic Legacy, that's toxic to every other plant, including the insects living in the soil, including the microbes living in the soil that are absolutely essential for us to have minerals in our food.
Right.
So
Exactly.
there's
Yes.
so many problems on so many levels. If we just focus on, okay, so you might grow tumors, you might have kidney problems, you might have liver problems. What's happening? Because I know you got really interested at the mineral level with with glyphosate and what is going on in the human body.
Right. Yes. I mean, I was studying autism. This is what brought me to that point, because in 2007, 2006, 2007 timeframe, I noticed that the autism rates were going up every year. And, we're just diagnosing it more, don't worry. But I didn't believe that. I thought there's something going on here. It's got to be environmental. I want to find it. That was basically my logic. And so I started looking, I started reading about autism to understand the underlying defects. It's a very interesting and complicated disease with many comorbidities. And one of the things was gut problems. I saw that very clearly from the papers I was reading. Lots of reports of autistic kids having gut issues, diarrhea, constipation, bloating, discomfort, all those kinds of things. Picky eaters, lots of food issues, lots of food allergies. I mean, just really something wrong with the gut. So I was looking for something that they were ingesting. I was figuring it's got to be something in the food. That's kind of where I was headed.
Mm-hmm.
I thought maybe antibiotics. I was toying with the idea that they were getting ear infections for some reason. They didn't have a very strong immune system. They were taking antibiotics. They were messing up the gut microbiome. I was working along those lines of disrupted gut microbiome was what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And then leaky gut, which of course leaky gut means the gut barrier is not solid. And then nasty things can leak out into the blood and cause a lot of immune problems, including autoimmune disease. So I was, imagining all of that. But then what is causing this was the big question. And I just happened to be at a conference where Professor Don Huber gave a talk. He gave a 2-hour presentation on glyphosate. I didn't know what glyphosate was. I knew Roundup, of course, but I didn't know what glyphosate was. And when I walked into the room, but I thought, well, this looks interesting. I should probably check this out. It's just kind of exploratory.
Yeah.
And I was on the edge of my seat. And by the end of those 2 hours, I was convinced I had the answer. It was that clear.
It all
was
lined up,
really
the
an
timeline.
epiphany. Yeah, and he basically presented I knew they had problems with minerals, like they had iron issues, they had manganese issues, they had gut issues, gut problems, and of course the gut-brain axis issue, and then the liver not being able to detoxify things that were being produced by the gut microbes. So the autistic kids had microbes that were pathogens that were producing toxic metabolites that were not being properly metabolized by the liver. That was something I was trying to figure out. And so he talked about the glyphosate chelating the minerals, making them unavailable. He talked about glyphosate acting as an antibiotic, messing up the balance of the microbes. And he talked about glyphosate disrupting the liver enzymes that detoxify metabolites, that are toxic. And so messing up all those things really gets you pretty close to a lot of the issues in the gut related to autism.
So it's dysbiosis, right? It's like it's really good at promoting dysbiosis in the microbiomes of the body.
And the reason is because the beneficial bacteria that we really depend on to help us digest our food are especially sensitive. And that's been shown in studies, so there were studies on cows, for example, where they looked at, and on chickens, there was especially one on chickens that looked at which microbes are especially sensitive to glyphosate. And they found at least 2 bifidobacteria and lactobacillus that are very sensitive. And then they showed that Clostridia, for example, is pretty hardy. They don't get killed as easily. Mm-hmm. And so you get Clostridia overgrowth. There's also desulforibrio, which is overrepresented in a lot of autistic kids and less sensitive to glyphosate. And there's especially something like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a pathogen that's been causing a lot of trouble in the hospitals lately. Mm-hmm. One of those pathogens that's resistant to all the antibiotics you throw at it, and it can kill you. You can pick up an infection in the hospital and die. And Pseudomonas is one of the very few bacteria that can completely metabolize glyphosate. So they can basically break it down and use its phosphorus as a source of phosphorus. Wow. That's super important. So I think it's, many of the pathogens that are causing a crisis right now are specific species that are able to metabolize. There aren't many that can metabolize glyphosate because it has a very tricky CP bond that's most microbes are stumped by. They don't know how to break that bond.
Huh. So will they start dosing people with the ones that do?
Well, yeah, what happens is that naturally the ones that thrive are the ones that can clear the glyphosate. It doesn't harm them because they can
Yeah.
just break it down, use it as a source of, energy and
Energy. Yeah.
phosphorus and nitrogen. It's really, they're happy. In fact, bacteria, those are the little guys in the oceans that are causing, the blue-green algae, so-called blue-green algae. They're actually not algae, but they're a bacterium, cyanobacteria. There's been a huge problem with them lately in the Great Lakes and in Florida. Lots of issues with cyanobacteria causing a whole toxic soup in the waterways. There's been articles about the manatees in Florida. Actually, I wrote one together with Jennifer Margulis. We published an article on the manatees in Florida, which are being clobbered. This year, they're really in trouble. Their numbers are way down. They're starving. I mean, they're just really a mess. And I think they're getting poisoned by glyphosate because there's a lot of glyphosate being used in the Everglades. I mean, there's both in the waterways directly to kill the weeds in the
Yeah.
waterways.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the lawns, the beautiful lawns of the big homes, they use lots of glyphosate. It runs off into the waterways. Then you have the sugarcane fields, they spray with the glyphosate right before harvest. So you got a lot of glyphosate. Even the orange groves, they're using glyphosate. It's probably what's causing their problem with the fungus disease. If they've got a big mess with the orange groves right now in Florida as well, with a fungus disease that the orange trees are succumbing to. And Don Huber, the guy who gave that 2-hour presentation, he's been working with farmers in Florida, where they have cured the problem of the fungus by simply growing their oranges organically.
Damn.
Yeah.
Wow. So can they make more money with organic? Can most farmers, or is it too hard to, I mean, is that the only, it's like, is there anything else they can do besides?
I know. There's a huge issue of making organic practical, because I think you sell it for more, for sure. You can get a better profit from the organic, except for the fact that it's a lot more costly to get rid of the weeds. So, controlling the weeds without using glyphosate involves manual labor in many cases. And so I know people who are working on, there's something called the Monarch tractor, which is pretty cool. And I know the guy who's been involved with that project. And it's actually, he's a member of the Mondavi family. So he's from the vineyards in California, and he spent some time in France and learned how to grow biodynamic wines. And so he wants to bring that back to California. So he's back in California now, and he's involved with this development of this tractor, which is a really cool gadget. It's solar powered, and it's got AI technology, so it can see things and it can recognize weeds, and it can kill them, I think maybe with hot water. I don't know exactly how it kills them, but it can go into the fields and find the weeds and shoot them, basically, with something non-toxic. So I think that kind of concept is really interesting and potentially a solution. So I think if we can, people are smart. The problem is that they don't understand the need for avoiding the toxic chemicals. In everything that we do, I think we have to always think in terms of safety first, because there's so many chemicals we're putting out into the environment with inadequate study. And we're kind of like, oh, what could go wrong, and we don't realize how toxic these things can be. And when we don't realize it's toxic, we don't think we need to fix it. It's really kind of a catch-22, because as long as you don't think it's toxic, and it's so easy, labor is something you don't really want to do. Usually people don't like to spend a lot of time pulling weeds,
Yeah.
So, but if you could pay, I think there'd be plenty of people who are now, struggling to get by, who would be quite happy to have a job going out and pulling weeds. I don't think it's a terrible, terrible job. I mean, I can think of a lot worse jobs myself,
Yeah, totally.
So it's
like spraying toxic chemicals for one.
I know, exactly. Do I want non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or do I want, to have some exercise? It's kind of like a no-brainer to me, which one I would take. In fact, that's what I did when I was, with my small kids. I never used Roundup, and I was out there pulling my dandelions, by the roots. I kind of enjoyed it, because you kind of have to work, get around the bottom and pull hard and kind of get the root, because it would break off and lose the root. So I learned how to do that to make sure I got the root so it wouldn't grow back.
I mean, a huge part of our community, like, we're into eating invasive weeds, because if you look at what's actually in the dandelion and the thistle and the chickweed and the bright mullein, it's like you have all these things that actually are just higher, much, much higher in those minerals. A lot of them are permaculture plants, so they're sending a deeper taproot than the disturbed soil, and they're replenishing the topsoil with their leafy green. So it's like, total mindset shift of,
I know.
what are we eating?
Dandelions, actually, there was a paper that showed that dandelions are protective against glyphosate, like to eat them. So eat the dandelion leaves. Yeah, they have protective.
It's in the leaf?
I think so. The dandelion leaves are protective against glyphosate. And there were some other, barberry was another one. There were three of them, and I forget what the third one was. It was a really fascinating paper that talked about these things being helpful to reduce the harm that you experience from glyphosate. Isn't that amazing? So I
That's
think people
amazing.
should be eating these things
Well, to
rather
me,
than
it makes sense.
spraying them with
Anything that's going to
glyphosate.
be like a liver cleanser, like even thistle, I would think. It's like
Hmm.
anything that's a liver cleanser, I would think would be beneficial. I know with the dandelion greens too, they're prebiotics, so that would help restore the
That's right. Well, that's
microbiome.
super important, by the way, because that's part of the issue with glyphosate. The microbes that break down the fiber. People talk about high fiber diet and they encourage people to take it. Some people say, no, I can't do that. It's too rough. It causes, it hurts my gut, because they don't have the bacteria that can break it down. Because those bacteria are really important, the ones in the gut that can break down that fiber. And they turn it into really, really useful fuel, which is the short chain fatty acids. Acetate, butyrate, and propionate. Those three short chain fatty acids are produced by the microbes from the fiber. And our own cells can't digest that, but these microbes can. Only those microbes need an acidic environment. And I have a chapter in my book on the gut microbiome. By the way, here's my book, Toxic Legacy,
Yay!
how the weed killer glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment. So there's a chapter in here on the gut, which that was a hard chapter to write. I had to do a lot of reading before I sort of sorted out the story. But what's clear to me is that glyphosate is raising, that studies have shown that glyphosate raises the pH of the gut. It makes it too basic. And it makes it too basic. So there's not enough acid. And then the acid loving bacteria can't thrive in that environment. And then the butyrate that they produce, which is super important as a fuel for the gut lining, that the colonocytes lining the gut, lining the gut stomach, lining the gut, the lower gut, those guys really love butyrate. That keeps them healthy. And butyrate can't be made if the pH is too high. The microbes that make it don't work. So you get a different set of microbes in that high pH environment, and you get insufficient butyrate, and you get inability to break down the fiber, which ends up being really rough on your gut because it sort of has to make its way out. It's not getting digested. So that's a huge problem right there.
So then you have the elimination issues.
Yeah.
It's like the one thing leads to the other. I mean, when I go back to like how does a country like ours end up, in a situation like this, and like what had to have happened for humans to want to toxify their ecosystems, right? If we just go back and go back. And I mean, one of the things that I see with not having natural childbirth much in this country in the last 100 years, right? It's like you take that power away from a woman to have a conscious birth, and then now she's going to be less protective of her yard, and now she's going to be less protective of the food she's putting in their body. And it's like all these breakdowns, right, that happened in human consciousness. And
that's really interesting. I had never thought of it that way, but I've always been I really like natural birth. In fact, I have 4 sons, and I didn't use any drugs for any of them. And the last 2 were born at home with midwives. So I was very much an advocate of natural birth, and I hated hospital birth experience. It was too much interference, from the doctors and the nurses. It was really a terrible experience for me in the hospital. And I had a really great experience at home with midwives.
Yeah, I mean, it's my sense is like the more in touch a society is with feminine power as well as masculine power, and the way you get feminine power, a lot of it is through natural childbirth, where you assist a woman in discovering her power within, and in that she becomes very protective.
That's very interesting.
Herself,
That's
her
a super good
baby,
point.
her yard, her ecosystem, and then you go back like when did we decide that matter was disconnected from spirit?
Right. And I can't imagine, and I know that this is what many women experience with childbirth. They're basically knocked out, and then they wake up, and then someone hands them a baby. This is your baby. That's like such a disconnect. I couldn't possibly imagine that.
Well, and the same thing they're discovering with the microbiome, even if we go back to like the autism studies and stuff, it's like, well, how many of them had natural childbirth? How many of them were nursed to term? All of which establishes the microbiome, the microbiomes of the baby's physiology. So you already have a baby that is a weakened microbiome, and then
especially if you have a C-section, that's really a huge issue. Then you don't even get the right microbes,
And you don't get not established
skin microbes instead of the gut microbes.
And now you get an infection, so then you get the antibiotics, and then you've got glycosides in the food, and then it's like
That's terrible.
and.
It's just a downward spiral. And then of course, once your gut gets sick, you sort of, the kids like a lot of these kids, they can only eat carbs, like sugars, like highly processed foods, right? A lot of the junk food. A lot of these kids won't eat anything that's kind of a substantial natural food, like a broccoli or like a even meats, like even or organ meats, which would be really healthy if they were organic,
Yeah.
and seafood, all these things that are really healthy that these kids don't even eat because they're like such picky eaters. They just want sort of a bread and cookies and
Yeah.
potato chips and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's really terrible because
It
a
is.
lot of these kids are incredibly picky eaters. That's what I've found with people. If I tell someone with an autistic child, I said, you really need to just give them cruciferous vegetables, really good for them with the sulfur, because sulfur is my thing. I really think sulfur deficiency and sulfur dysbiosis is a huge part of autism. And so I always encourage people to feed their kids sulfur containing foods. So broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. And they'll say, well, oh, my kid wouldn't eat that, just like, no, there's no way, it's just kind of, they give up right from the get-go.
So what happens when you ferment the cruciferous? Does the sulfur become more bioavailable?
Oh, I don't know, actually. I'm not, I mean, like fermented cabbage is a really good food for sure. Yes.
Right?
It changes, of course, it does change the molecules that are in the food because the fermentation process is a sort of a partially digesting the food. So you typically get lactate, which is a super good fuel. Lactate's a good food, You
Yeah.
get more lactate. That's one of the things. And probably, I mean, fermentation is complicated because I think sometimes it can actually introduce new metabolites that could be toxic, but it also takes away metabolites that are toxic. So there's kind of a whole mix of things. And things are not toxic if your liver's working, but if your liver's not working, the cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver are crucial for metabolizing many of these complex molecules that are made by these microbes. And so it becomes liver toxic if the liver can't use those enzymes to break it down.
Right. So have other countries have avoided the use of this pesticide or not?
A few. Brazil, I think. I mean, not Brazil, Bermuda. I think Bermuda has always banned glyphosate because of the coral. I believe that's true, or maybe they only banned it at some point, but I think they don't allow glyphosate in Bermuda. So that's a really good example. There was also Nicaragua, which had some restrictions because it was killing the farmers, the sugarcane farmers in Central America have developed a really nasty kidney disease that they tried to deflect away from glyphosate to not blame it, but it's very clear to me glyphosate's a causal factor in that disease. It's killing farmers in their 40s, their kidney failure. And
that's through airborne exposure mostly, do you think, or?
Yeah, I think it has to do with, in fact, their symptoms act up at the harvest. At the time of harvest, they get worse symptoms. The studies have shown that the harvest is somehow providing some kind of toxicity to their symptoms. Well, they spray the sugarcane with glyphosate, shortly before harvest, and then they harvest it, and they're right there in the in the midst of all of that,
right? Airborne,
breathing it in. I mean,
it could be anywhere.
All kinds of contact during the harvest, I think, is when they get the most damage. And the same thing for Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was having issues with farmers. It wasn't sugarcane, I think it was rice farmers in Sri Lanka that were dying of kidney failure, and that was also traced to glyphosate, and they banned it. Sri Lanka banned glyphosate for a couple of years, and then of course there was a lot of pressure to bring it back, and there was a lot of black market, use. I mean, it's just the farmers really want it because it makes life so much easier.
Yeah.
And then the government eventually gives in and says, all right, fine, you can go ahead and use it. It's just so interesting that it kind of goes back and forth. They realize the toxicity, they fight it off. They realize the need for it, they bring it back. It's really interesting.
Do we have any idea of like how long crops with these genetically modified seeds and the glyphosate, like how many cycles does it go through before the earth does not produce the crop?
I know. Well, that's a big question. And that's actually what they found, when they first started rolling out the GMO crops, which was in the late 1990s. And the first couple of years, the farmers were really happy. The yield was considerably higher, and life was a lot easier. They were very happy with it. But then they started to notice that the yield started going down and the crops started getting sick. When there's a drought, it's hit harder than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more problems with insects. The soil's not healthy anymore. So the crops doesn't have as much nutritional value. These things are slowly degrading over time. A study in Brazil showed They looked at the soil year by year, and they were using glyphosate on the crop every year. And they found that every year there was more glyphosate in the soil than there was the year before. In other words, it's not going away. It's not, it's
It's not
accumulating.
breaking down, it accumulates. So it
That's
shows up
really, really
more and more in the
dangerous.
crops.
Right.
So
Every
those who
year,
are
because
eating
we're,
conventional now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they're getting a much
they won't
larger
live very
dosage.
long. They're going to have a short life, I'm afraid. Yes. I think it's really coming to a head right now in our country. And I think it's the reason why we're having such a mess with COVID-19. One of the factors in the United States, because, if you look at COVID-19 and the people who are most susceptible to a serious case of COVID-19, it's been well established. There's a whole list of comorbidities, right? Obesity,
Yeah.
diabetes,
Any chronic inflammation, right? Anything
high
with
blood pressure, even Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a risk factor.
Yeah.
Heart disease, all those things are risk factors for bad outcome with COVID. And all those things are caused by glyphosate. Glyphosate is one of the causal factors, I believe.
Mm-hmm. So how much is our chronic inflammation epidemic including the obesity epidemic? How much of that is, and a lot of just to help people connect the dots with obesity, it's connected now to metabolic syndrome, which is this destruction of the gut lining. So how much of this do you think would not have happened, even with all the fast food, all the convenience food, all the screen time, sitting around time? How much of this do you think is the issue?
That's a big question, isn't it? I think a lot more than people realize. I would love to have been able to do the experiment of having, in fact, we've done the experiment of having another culture where glyphosate's not used, and to see what they're like. And in fact, if you look at Africa, for example, Africa is interesting with respect to obesity because there's kind of a dividing line between countries that are pretty skinny, really very low obesity rates, and countries that have a big problem with obesity. There's a dividing line. You basically can put all the countries in one bin or the other. And the ones that have an obesity problem are South Africa and the Mediterranean coast, all the ones on the Mediterranean coast. And those are all the ones that get exposed to a lot of glyphosate. Most of Africa is still the small farmer, mostly organic, much lower use of glyphosate than in the United States. The United States probably uses more per person than any other country in the world. We use 20% of the world's glyphosate with 4 or 5% of the world's population. So we are way out there as far as our use of glyphosate. And it shows in our health problems, all these problems that we're having, the autism, the obesity, the diabetes, the high blood pressure, the cancers, of course, the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I think breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer, kidney cancer, liver failure, kidney failure. I mean, all these things that are going up, even something like endometriosis, I think they're all connected. And autism, Alzheimer's, many of the neurological diseases, all connected to glyphosate. And we don't know what percentage of it is due to the glyphosate, but I would really love to have an A/B experiment where you had everything else that's here except for the glyphosate, and see what happens, because I think it would be a big improvement.
So crops that are not, well, actually, let me ask you this. People that are buying fresh fruit and vegetables, strawberries, grapes that are not organic, how much is it how much of it are these genetically engineered too, or is it mostly those?
They're not genetically engineered. And I think there's glyphosate, but I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure, well, I know they use it, for example, on the grapes for the wine. It's in the wines. Zen Honeycutt tested lots of California wines, including biodynamic wines. She found glyphosate in all of them, much lower numbers in the ones that were organic, but not zero. Because it's in California, you can't avoid it. Even if you're not using it, it ends up in the water, in the rain.
Yeah.
So you still get it. So it's kind of disappointing that even organic is not necessarily free of glyphosate, but consistently organics have considerably lower numbers. So you're much better off to eat certified organic. The fruits, I know they use it in the orange grove, so I suspect they're using it on the strawberries as well. There's other things they use on those fruits that are bad, and people are, they talk about the dirty dozen, and I think people really encourage you to buy organic strawberries, but they're not thinking of the glyphosate. They're thinking of the insecticides, and the fungicides. There's those other chemicals that are also bad. And I know chlorpyrifos is quite nasty. That's an insecticide. And the fungicides are nasty too. So, all of them are bad. I think we should get rid of all the chemicals that are used in agriculture. I think we should the government, if they would mandate something, I would love them to mandate that we can't grow food with toxic chemicals. We have to use organic. Any kind of, pest control thing you use has to be organic. That would be the first thing I would do if I were president.
Start with common sense.
I hate a lot of these government mandates, but I would sure like that one.
Like if
I
it's
would
going
say
through your
yes.
organs, it should be organic. Let's start
Yeah.
there,
It just
right?
seems like idiocy to put poisons on your food. I don't understand how
Right.
that can possibly be a good idea,
Right. Yeah.
And
No,
it's
because they don't care. Yeah. So the best thing people can do is promote organics, help other people understand why to buy organic. And that's really, as far as like the typical listener, that's really the best thing they can do.
I think so. That's really number one. I have a couple of other things I recommend to stay healthy that are kind of unusual, probably. One is sunlight. I don't know if you know that I'm a big fan of sunlight, and I don't like sunscreen, and I don't like sunglasses. So out in the sun without sunscreen, without sunglasses.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm a good case study because I wore glasses for a good part of my life. My vision's not perfect, but probably 20 years ago, I started to feel like I needed to have full sun exposure. So I would take off my glasses when I'd be outside. I just kind of take them off, when
Yeah.
I'd leave the house. And then eventually I just took them off all the time. I just said, I
Yeah.
don't need these glasses. I've never worn sunglasses. And now I don't wear glasses. I don't wear them to read, and I don't wear them for distance. I can drive without, I'm not probably legally allowed to drive without glasses, but if I know where I'm going, I can read the signs, but not as well as I could if I had my glasses on. I have glasses, I just hardly ever wear them.
Yeah. That's
And my
impressive.
and my eyes are great. I don't have any eye issues, and I'm 73 years old. Lots of my friends have already had cataract surgery. I'm fine. So
Well, especially through the amount of writing you've done, because
I
the
know I look at
amount
the
of,
computer screen all day long. It's just kind of, I'm really amazed that my eyes are doing so well, but it kind of violates the rules, right?
yeah.
Because you're supposed to wear sunglasses to protect your eyes from the sun. And that is what is so idiocy, because I don't think that's true. I think it's the opposite. But a problem is that glyphosate attacks the eyes.
Uh,
And that's Anthony Samsel actually has a hold of a whole bunch of documents from Monsanto. He got a hold of them through the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. He's got a huge stack of them at his home, and he's been reading them. They're kind of tedious to get into, but he's found many papers showing toxicity to the eyes in animal studies. The glyphosate goes into the eyes and becomes toxic there. And I think it disrupts the eye's ability to handle sunlight correctly. One of the things is melanin. Melanin, the skin tanning agent, there's also neuromelanin in the brain. Melanin is a super important molecule for protecting from the sun.
it's a
That's what gets,
neuroprotectant, right, in the brain?
yes, right. A neuroprotectant in the brain is neuromelanin. It's the black that makes the substantia nigra, the black body. I think that stands for substantia nigra, which is where you get Parkinson's if that gets destroyed. And of course, it's the substantia nigra sits behind the eyes come in to the pineal gland. The pineal gland picks up that sunlight, which is super important for the daylight cycle, the night day cycle, to figure that out, to sleep well. You need the sunlight to the pineal gland. And that comes in through the eyes, and then also the substantia nigra is picking up that sunlight. And but it because of its melanin, it knows how to use the sunlight very effectively to put it to good use. But the melanin is a product of the shikimate pathway. It comes out of that shikimate pathway, which glyphosate blocks. And so you can get a deficiency in melanin. And then glyphosate also disrupts a whole bunch of other things that causes inflammation. It depletes your ability to protect from reactive oxygen. So that's a crucial thing. You need to have the reactive oxygen to do all the things that the metabolism does, but you need to be able to quench it very fast and make sure it doesn't go someplace it's not supposed to go, And you have antioxidant molecules that do that, but glyphosate messes them up. It messes up the whole glutathione system. Glutathione becomes depleted and it becomes oxidized with glyphosate. That's been shown in studies. And glutathione is a super important antioxidant to protect you from reactive oxygen, which is induced by sunlight. So it's sort of like if the system's working well, sunlight's good for you. But if you have, and a lot of people will say to me, well, I never tan. I go out in the sun, I don't tan. I just turn red. That means the melanin's not working,
Right. Boy, so it's like one thing, just stacks on the other. That whole reactive oxygen species, to me, where my mind goes right away with that is that genetics and the environment which your DNA cells are trying to reproduce then becomes inhospitable to our human DNA cells replicating properly.
Exactly. Yeah. As long as you're not being poisoned, your body can handle things like sunlight very, very well and use it to its advantage. Use it as a source of energy if you're not being poisoned. But the things that you need to do that get messed up by the poisons, and then it becomes toxic.
So did you see, just in closing, I want to ask you, did you see the article in the New York Times, Meet the Peace Cyclers, Their idea to help farmers is number one. That
No,
one, it was like,
no.
okay, so that came out, let's see, it looks like it came out earlier in June 2022 in New York Times. One of our communities really gone deep into urine therapy, and one of the ways urines has been used over time as it's high in nitrogen. You got uric acid and you've got urea, both of which are super high in nitrogen. And so farmers have used it forever until now to basically. So what we're seeing is this resurgence and understanding of, I mean, a lot of what we do here is ancient wisdom, like made modern, right? And so this whole idea of like, oh, actually farmers forever were, I mean, even in Rome, they were gathering that you had to donate your pee for crops.
That's really interesting. Of course, sewage should be a really good fertilizer. I mean, that's a whole natural thing. That's a natural cycle with cows, right? Living on the grass, and they poop, and that's the fertilizer for the grass.
Yeah.
The whole thing is very natural.
Same thing with the peas. The peas are the nitrogen fixing agents, right? So if we look at the
really
interesting urea that's in fertilizers, right?
Yes, that's so interesting. And now, of course, it's a big problem because sewage is toxic, and it's toxic in part because of glyphosate. But it's also toxic because of all the drugs we take. So this is a huge problem. There's a study that showed metformin. And metformin is a very common drug that people are taking for diabetes, which of course they have because of glyphosate. So they're taking metformin. Metformin is very hard to break down. They pee it out, and then it gets into the sewage system. And actually they were just dumping it into the ocean, and then it caused the fish to become bisexual. It messed up their sexuality.
Oh, right. I read that one.
Yeah, metformin.
If you look back, if you like take a deep time perspective and it's like, let's say it's 200, say we survive this and it's 200 years from now, is your perspective that we'll just look back at this time as like chemical warfare against humans and the planet?
I do. I think, well, here's my prediction. It's hard to know what's going to happen, right? But I think we're going to get decimated. I think our population is going to implode, mostly in the developed countries. We're going to be so sick we can't reproduce, right? Because we're losing our fertility right and left. And male sperm counts are down, sperm mobility is down. Women have problems with endometriosis and polycystic ovary syndrome, all kinds of issues with reproduction, male and female, all caused by our toxic chemical exposures. And so many people will be unable to have children, and others may be able to have children, but not sure they want them because it's a 50% autism rate, So we're going to stop having kids. We're going to have very few children. We're going to implode. That's what I think is going to happen. And all the while that's happening, of course, we're all going to be sick too. Alzheimer's at the age of 40, we're going to have really lots of rheumatoid arthritis and all kinds of health issues, knee surgeries and hip surgeries. We're already doing that. And it's just going to be more and more of all this stuff. And then people will be very sick. People won't want to have kids. A very dark, dark time. And our numbers will go way down quickly because once nobody's reproducing, you disappear pretty quickly. So there'll be a lot less of us, which will be good, probably. I hate to say that, but
and do you think a small group of people will continue to get healthier? I mean, the ones
that's what I'm hoping. There will be a group, and I hope that they'll be my descendants, right? They will figure it out sooner rather than later, do it right, be confident to have kids and healthy kids. And so there'll be a growing population of the people who have managed to avoid the chemicals. And they'll also be the people who don't want to use the chemicals, right? So they're going to say, look, guys, we got to wake up. We got to do something different. It needs to happen. It needed to happen yesterday, but it needs to happen right now. We need to be big in terms of rolling out organic farming. I think that'll be the number one thing we need to do. Switch to organic. I would say small family farms. Let's go back to small family farms. And like the whole problem with the sewer system, it's a huge problem right now because the stuff is so toxic. But if it weren't toxic, it would make great fertilizer, right? So we wouldn't have to use the nitrate and phosphate fertilizers, which are very synthetic. Fertilizers are not good either. So the whole natural system is right. It's the right way to do agriculture. It'll keep us healthy. It'll keep the soil healthy. It'll even reverse climate change, I believe, because I think a part of the issue with climate change is the agriculture, the industrial agriculture. Nitric oxide is a much worse, nitrous oxide and nitrous oxide is a much worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's like over 100 times worse. And methane is too. And glyphosate is causing the cows to produce a lot of methane because of the enzymes that bring the methane back into organic matter are not working. So the cows release a lot more methane when they're eating toxic food. And the methane is a super strong greenhouse gas. So we've got both the nitrogen oxides, the methane, and of course the carbon dioxide, which is not being taken in because glyphosate disrupts the ability of the plants to convert carbon dioxide into organic matter. There's an enzyme in plants called rubisco. It's got a fun name. Rubisco stands for something, and I don't know what it is. The ru and the bis and the co are each the beginning of a long word, but rubisco is its nickname. A fun enzyme. It's the biggest, it's the most common enzyme on the planet. It's only in plants, but they have tons of it. And it's essential for making organic matter out of carbon dioxide. So the plants become deficient in their ability to convert carbon dioxide to organic matter. And a major part of the carbon problem is that the plants aren't fixating the carbon into the ground, right? Because once the plants pull it in, and then it goes into the soil, and it can stay there, eventually becoming coal, for example, but you're trapping it in the soil. And you're not doing that enough if you've got glyphosate all over the place. So I think if we clean up our agriculture, that will go a long ways towards solving our carbon emission problem, which of course is also going to do us in. So we're pretty much, we're in trouble everywhere we look. And unless we wake up and totally change our ways, it's goodbye. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's goodbye. So we have to do something soon, or we're going to be in huge trouble. We are in huge trouble already.
Yeah.
So,
and so the number one, it's really like the number one thing people can do is like get involved with local farmers, promote organic,
exactly.
pay more, eat less, eat healthier.
Exactly. Yeah, spend the extra money on food and you'll get it back on your medical expenses.
Yeah.
And you'll feel a lot healthier and happier.
Yeah. And there's so much food waste anyways. I mean, the other component that came up earlier when you mentioned organ meat, like I live in cattle country to some degree. I'm in Wyoming, and the farmers that I've talked to here, they're throwing out bones, hooves,
oh yes,
organs, because people don't buy, because I'm always like, give me your liver, you know. Like,
I know, it's so terrible. Those are the healthiest parts of the animal.
So we're recovering that, right? Like this, you know, for those cultures that ate meat, like Native Americans, it's like it's the whole animal, it's the whole, everything's
exactly
useful.
Yes. And of course, because of the toxic chemicals, the liver is really toxic. That's really unfortunate, because it's one of the healthiest organs you can eat. It's got so much nutritional value.
It's organic.
Yeah, but it's hard to get organic liver.
It's hard to get organic liver. Yeah, really.
I bet you the liver looks so awful they wouldn't sell it anyway, because it'll be fatty liver. Glyphosate causes fatty liver disease. That's very clear, actually. They did a study on rats with small doses of glyphosate, and they showed that it caused fatty liver disease. And we've got an epidemic in that. And even a study on humans found that they looked at people with fatty liver disease, and they had 3 groups: the no fatty liver, less advanced fatty liver, and advanced fatty liver. And they were able to separate them out just by looking at the glyphosate in the urine. They had statistically significant differences among all 3 groups, which was amazing to me. Wow. That they could correlate that so well.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So absolutely petrifying, but enlightening. I really appreciate your work in this world and all that you're doing to raise the issue at every level, whether it's the scientific.
I know, it's really, we are in an emergency situation, and unless we acknowledge that and then change our ways, we're basically toast. It's either goodbye or fix things. So I think the choice is obvious, but
yeah, awesome. And go buy organic.
Exactly. That's number one. Go buy organic, and to explain to your neighbors and your relatives why they should also go buy organic, and get them to do it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.